I want to see specific funds, not funds that are necessarily 0.1% of the entire amount that's under management by a firm, but actual, real, genuine investment into people who have been historically disadvantaged.
Do you want to go back to normal after Corona? Do you really want to go back to normal? I don't. Welcome to Not Back to Normal. I am Marcus Drun, and I want COVID-19 to change the business world for the better. In each episode, I talk to entrepreneurs, business leaders, and changemakers about how they have adapted in this crisis and how they further intend to change the way they live, work, and run their businesses for the better to make capitalism much more conscious and working for all. In this episode, I'm speaking with Erika Brodnock. Erika is a serial tech entrepreneur from London and currently the CEO of Kami, a digital companion for parents throughout their parenting journey. She's also part of the core team at Extend Ventures, which aims to democratize access to venture capital, especially for entrepreneurs and talent from disadvantaged communities. She's a visiting research fellow at King's College and will start her Ph.D. at UCL in September this year. In other words, Erika is a top dog in both hands-on problem solving and academic rigor. In this episode, Erika makes the compelling case to invest more into diverse communities, especially after COVID-19. Not just because it's morally the right thing to do, but also because this would lead to more economic growth and higher returns to investors. Erika and I go back 7 years when I experienced her as a force of nature during my time at Wira, Telefonica Startup Accelerator. The timing of our conversation couldn't have been any more relevant as we discuss Black Lives Matter, white male privilege, and unconscious bias, all from a business perspective. You will hear towards the end how I unintentionally reveal my own blind spots with regards to these matters, and that's okay, because change can only ever start with yourself and in the here and now. I'm glad that Erika called me out because I don't want to go back to that kind of normal. I really love this insightful and for me at times a bit uncomfortable episode. And without further ado, please welcome Erika Brodnock. Erika, thanks for coming on the podcast.
You're most welcome, Marcus. It's fantastic to connect with you again. It's been a long time.
It indeed has been, I think, almost 7 years since we met at Wira, Telefonica Startup Accelerator. And back in the days, you were the founder of Charisma Kids. And I certainly remember you as a force of nature. And I'm quite curious to hear, what do you do these days? What do you do for a living? What do you do professionally right now?
Right. I do a couple of things, Marcus. You'll be pleased to hear that Charisma Kids is still going. So I'm a non-exec at Charisma Kids. I also founded a company, Kami, which is a chatbot that supports parents to balance their mental health and well-being so that they can become their child's best first teacher. And then in addition to that, I've been looking at conducting some research with some colleagues who we've recently formed Extend Ventures. Extend Ventures is all around looking at how underrepresented groups are funded and trying to establish the funding gap that exists for those underrepresented founders.
Yeah, and there's a lot going on right now in the world, from COVID-19 to lockdown to what happens in the States and in the UK, Black Lives Matter. How does it affect you and how do you feel about it all, Erika?
So the last few months have been a bit of a whirlwind. I went from living a normal day-to-day life, traveling back and forth into the city on a day-to-day basis for various meetings, whether that it was to get Kami off the ground or to partner up with individuals who were interested in exploring the plight of underrepresented founders. And all of a sudden, everything kind of just went into disarray. There was no hour-long commute. So I found personally that working days had been extended. And what used to be something that I disliked, which was traveling back and forth on tube tubes and trains into central London, I now look at as a respite, because now I kind of seem to work from the moment that I open my eyes until I physically force myself to stop at about 8 p.m. at night. There's something to kind of explore around work-life balance in the new normal, or this kind of working from home existence that we're in at the moment. But in addition to that, I'm having to kind of homeschool my 13-year-old daughter in particular. And I have been emotionally quite distressed over the last couple of weeks since the brutal slaying of George Floyd. For those of us that are sort of Black and living in the UK, we've kind of known that there are microaggressions and all sorts of racism that we encounter on a day-to-day basis for many, many years. I guess what's happened most recently is that it's really come to the fore, and there are a lot more people noticing what we've known for quite some time. And that's been interesting from a number of perspectives, because there's been a little bit of surprise from my side that people didn't realise what was going on in the world before the last few weeks. And then there's also been lots of management. So I am running two businesses and looking at a big piece of research. And lots of my day is now also spent kind of fielding questions about how I'm feeling, sometimes having to manage the emotions of people who didn't realise there was a problem before. And that has been emotionally draining.
I mean, I can imagine, and then I can't, I guess, because I'm a white man, and that's what people typically ascribes to as the people who dominate the world. And I've obviously thought about how we would discuss this and how we would explore this in this episode, because there is something about the old normal that didn't work for Black people, for women, for gay people, for anyone who's basically not part of this, I guess, this heteronormative, white, middle class, upper class, male dominating strata of the world. And at the same time, I do not feel shame to be white and a man. But at the same time, I know that stuff wasn't working before. I know that lives were not good and not pleasant and horrific. There's a whole spectrum, obviously, as you said, there are microaggressions and there's murder and all sorts of stuff. So what do you not want to go back to in terms of the old normal? What worked for you? What did you like about the old normal? I mean, you're a tech entrepreneur, you've got funding, so there's something clearly good about your life. And then at the same time, as you just alluded to, that it hasn't been working well in some other respects for a long time. And we as a society, we've just disconnected from it, just like we've disconnected from nature and other things. It's actually Chris McCulloch, whom you also know from Wyra, who's been the previous guest on the podcast. He basically said that COVID-19 is just unmasking everything that was there before. And now out of a sudden, because of the deceleration, because of the lockdown, we're out of a sudden really, really forced to look at it. What of the old normal would you want to have back, and what rather not?
It's a really mixed bag, Marcus, because there are some aspects of the old normal that I absolutely adored. I love being able to work. I like being social. I love being able to communicate with people face to face and not have to do so over Zoom or some other form of electronic device. I like being able to switch off and have a sacred space that is home, that doesn't necessarily end up being a working space, because one daughter's downstairs in the front room, another one is in the dining room. So I then end up having to work in my room, which would ordinarily be my sanctuary. And so being able to kind of really balance work and life and not being sort of in the house 24/7, it would be lovely to go back to the old normal where we could pretty much roam as we pleased, and weekends were spent, out with the children and doing things as a family. So I want to be able to go back to that side of things, but I don't want to go back to potentially being discriminated against. So my entire life, I've been subject to unspoken rules that included only 2 school children at a time being allowed into our local shops perhaps when I was sort of 14 to 15. Now, I'm not sure that that happened to all school children, if you know what I mean, to walking around my local Superdrug and being trailed by a security guard because they think that automatically I'm a female from a certain demographic, therefore, and I live in an area that isn't representative of my demographic, therefore I must be up to no good. And that happens to me on a regular basis, if that makes sense. And as you said, I am a tech entrepreneur. I have no reason or inclination to ever steal. But nonetheless, that's what I often judged as because of the colour of my skin. I don't want to go back to that old normal. I don't want to be judged as a female and therefore it be assumed that I don't have the acumen to be able to run a tech company. But then equally, as a Black person, I'm judged on a whole host of different levels. And I think that one of the things that in the new normal we need to really explore and look at is intersectionality, and the fact that I grew up a working class Black female. And if you have all three of those things, for want of a better expression, stacked against you, the prognosis for your outcomes can be quite bleak. And I'd like to ensure that actually that isn't normal for other people that are in the circumstances that I grew up in. I don't think it's right that when we have peaceful protests that are being undertaken by Black people, they're called riots. And then when you actually have rioting and defecation of statues and monuments, etc., they're called protests. And that's still happening even in this normal. So I'd like to see some stark changes to the way that we're represented as people from working classes, as people from other ethnicities, and as people from different genders, as people that have different sexualities and physical abilities as well, and indeed mental abilities or disabilities. And so I think that we definitely need to work towards a fairer society. I think that it's in everybody's interest to work towards a fairer society. I think when you have the debate around Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, I think Black Lives Mattering to everybody is something that we should all be aspiring to for as the new normal, because when everyone's lives matter, Black people will be included in that. And currently we aren't. And that is a fact. And that's across tech, it's across media, it's across all manner of industries, fintech, financial industries, and in general. Every time I go on to a call in the last few months and we're looking at the impacts of COVID, the disproportionality that exists among Black and minority communities is astounding. The fact that many people, I believe 60% from some of the communities that I belong to, are living beneath the median poverty line, while there are numbers of people that are living very affluent lives. And I think one of the things that I'm not necessarily over enamored with this new normal is the fact that actually it's encouraging silos and bubbles. So if I don't have friends that are outside of my usual sphere of influence, then I'm not going to see people starving. I'm not going to see that actually if the government cancel free school meals over this summer, there are likely to be children that will starve to death as a result of that. Won't come across my day-to-day life. I won't see people who are homeless because I'm staying in all the time. So I think that we do need to make an actual effort to see what's going on in the lives of people that we aren't necessarily encountering on a day-to-day basis. And that's going to be all the more important as we adjust to this new normal.
And listening to you, I definitely noticed something in my chest. It's quite heavy, it's quite tense. I'm toying between, should we dive into what's sort of like really going on? Like, what is the core problem here? Is it racial equality, inequality? Is it economic disparity, like this whole thing about the 1% and the 90%, or maybe the 9% in between, where I consider myself to be lucky to be part of? So that's sort of like one route we could take, or we could take the kind of like magic wand route, sort of like by invoking a quote from Buckminster Fuller. in the mid-20th century, quite a prolific polymath. He basically said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you need to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And when you hear that, Erika, with the resources, with the network, with the skills, with the talent, I mean, you're also embarking on a PhD, you have your company. If you had a magic wand, what new model would you want to create?
I done this piece of work probably last summer, Marcus. And when I thought about what new reality I'd want to create, I thought that it would be one that was evidence-based and one that looked at how we were able to support and reward and encourage and facilitate people based on their strengths, the content of their character rather than the colour of their skin. And so I wanted to undertake a piece of research that looks at how many people are funded and what people do with funding once they get it, who takes money that's invested in them and is able to create a return to the investors that invest in them. Thankfully, over in the States, the Kaufman Fellows did a similar piece of research, and they looked at how money was being distributed and what people were doing with the money that they were given. And their research showed, it was published in January of this year, that founders from other ethnicities that were invested in were likely to return increases of up to 30% to their investors. So if you look at the economic value add of the status quo businesses, ethnic founders were returning 30% more than that. Now, if we take that as a baseline, we should be investing more in ethnicities, not because it's the charitable thing to do, but because it actually makes good business sense to invest in these companies and to enable them to provide returns to themselves as entrepreneurs, returns to their communities, and then returns to the investors that have made the investments. And I think that that would be an incredible new normal. There isn't a pipeline issue. We have entrepreneurs from all walks of life, not just middle class, not just white, not just male, but from all walks of life, including Black working class females, of which I am one, Asian females that are middle class. Entrepreneurs come from all walks of life. And I think that if we can turn around and create vehicles that mean that we are able to invest in entrepreneurship, we will be able to alleviate poverty for many of the people in our society that are currently being disproportionately affected by COVID, but also by stop and search, and also by abject states of poverty, which then lead to poor mental and physical health. And I think that we would be able to really start to right some of the wrongs that many historically disadvantaged communities are still facing right now in 2020. And obviously, COVID is shining a bright light on.
What do you think it will take to make that new model, that new normal reality in context of people in power never really let go of the power freely and, willingly and easily? And what comes to mind is sort of like a real epiphany I had when I read a book called The Lessons of History, which basically really says that in history, there has only ever been two scripts. One is legislation redistributes wealth, or revolution to distribute poverty. And if I zoom out from what happens in the UK, what happens in the US and in other parts of the world, for me, just definitely begs the question where we headed at in terms of, will people like me, I mean, I do belong obviously to the white male, middle class that have, if you go back the last 400 years, created the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and even the early stages of the digital revolution were all white men. Now it's sort of like moving more towards Indian CEOs of big tech companies. This is just the way it is, right? This is the world that we've created in the last 400 years, and this has been the dominant part of it. And as much as I struggle and really, really try to be different, and sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fail, but I'm not in power, as if I was a politician or a CEO of a big company or somebody with a lot of assets. And so from where you see the world, Erika, and basically your community and the people that you mingle with, what's your view on what does it take to really, really change things?
First of all, Marcus, and I want you to take this with the love in which it's sent, there were a number of statements that you made there about who actually been responsible for the creation of sort of industrial revolutions and innovation, etc. And I'd like to unpick that a little bit first, just because I don't believe that these innovations are always created by white middle class males. I think they take the credit for them, but I'm not sure that they're the ones who actually create them. And so I think that there's history is told by the person who's telling the story, right? But I think that if we delve a little bit deeper, we'll find that actually Asian communities and Black communities have been responsible, as well as other minorities all over the world, have been responsible for lots of the innovations that we've seen. And then I think that one, we need to speak to truth to power. And two, we need to look at what motivates people in power to want to do something differently. A big motivator is money and financial returns. I've seen that actually the Rose Review of Female Entrepreneurship came out early last year and said that based on the information that we have at the moment, if we were to invest in 600,000 more female entrepreneurs, it would return £250 billion to the economy. And I think that when people in power are presented with stats like that, and they are able to see that actually changing some of the structures is going to be beneficial, not just to the people that would obviously seem to benefit from it, but actually to them as well, I think that sometimes you then start to get some movement in the right direction. And that was exactly the basis on which I kind of said, right, okay, let's form Extend Ventures. Let's get this completely robust in terms of ensuring that it's part of a PhD, and that PhD is being done at one of the best institutions in the country, ensuring that there is absolutely unwavering conclusion that comes from the study that says actually by changing some of the power structures and distributing some of the wealth in a slightly different way, we can create this amount of change. And this is what that's going to translate to for one, the people that are invested in, two, the communities that they come from, and three, the economy at large. Now, I don't know exactly what the research is going to say because it isn't complete yet, but I would hope that we would see something similar to that which we've seen from the Kaufman Fellows in the States and from the Rose Review of Female Entrepreneurship. And that will stimulate some of what we've seen over the last 12 months for females, which is there's now an Investing in Women code that venture capitalists are being asked to sign up to. But then I actually think should be made more widespread than just VCs. It should be for crowdfunding platforms. It should be for angel investors, etc., so that everybody is starting to be held to account and being asked to change their behaviour. I also think that we need to look at the tools of psychological behavioural change, as you said before, create a new normal that makes the old normal obsolete, thus propelling people to move towards a new status quo. I think it was Henry Ford that said if you had asked people if they wanted a car, they would have said no, they want a faster horse and carriage. And it's a case of actually saying, no, this is what we're creating, and then showing how that's going to be beneficial and encouraging people to migrate. And I don't think that it's going to happen easily. I don't think that the current power structures are going to want to make changes without kicking and screaming. But I do think that what's happening now is that actually more and more of the world is waking up to the fact that we cannot continue as we are at the moment. It's just not possible. So you're seeing that actually many middle class, white males, females, working class, whoever, everyone is uniting against the fact that actually there is this disparity at the moment and that it's not working for any of us.
No. And one thing that I'd like to stitch together is what you do with Kami. We talked about our kids, and I work in change. I work in executive coaching, change consulting, and most of my clients are probably my age, somewhere in the mid-40s. Some of them are actually younger now, in the mid-30s. And the older you get, the harder it is to actually change. And so looking at the next generation, our kids, what does it take in terms of education policy and especially changes in those policies so that the next generation just comes to this whole, I guess, economic game that we're really playing here with a much more enlightened, with a more aware, with a more mindful and emotionally intelligent perspective, so that they can basically change it from within, as in like from the next generation, and probably starting to push and prod us parents and especially the people in power structures, as you referred to basically just really demand that change, because it cannot work for them. I mean, my son is, on TikTok, on other social media all the time, globally, with lots of global interactions. He clearly understands that there is only one human race. I mean, biologically, this whole thing of race doesn't even exist. It's just a construct. And so zooming into this part of your professional and perhaps personal life, and also thinking about Ken Robbins, who famously said, you have to find your element. Don't go for a degree just because everyone else does it. You have to really do what you're good at, what you love doing, and then eventually, you'll find passion, purpose, and ultimately a nice living. And also contrasting that with this whole wave of digitization, AI, automation, which makes more and more jobs redundant as we know them. What is your view on the next generation? What's going to happen, and how can people like you and want people like you shape, I guess, the emerging reality for our kids?
There are two aspects that I touch on to answer that question, Marcus. The first is that it starts with the parents. And the second is around the concept of meta-learning. So to take the first and start with the parents, much of what children learn is through osmosis. And parents can tell children to behave in a particular way. But if children see parents behaving in the opposite way to the way that they're telling them to behave, they will pick up and learn the behavior that parents are displaying rather than the behavior that parents are saying. Do as I say, not as I do, doesn't actually work. So parents need to model the behavior that they want to see from their children. And that is everything from shouting in the house, being on time when they need to go somewhere, right the way down to the way that we treat people from other demographics that don't necessarily look, sound, feel, or what have you like we do. We are predisposed as a human race to like people that are like ourselves. And so particularly in what is being described as the new normal, where parents are kind of being more insular and only speaking to their own sort of little networks, we need to make sure that we are setting the example that we want to see. So teaching children to be more tolerant starts with showing children how to be more tolerant. So it's about ensuring that you have a mix of friends that are representative of the tolerance level that you want to display, rather than the tolerance level that you say you want to have, if that makes sense. Living in Surrey myself, I know that we are surrounded by a certain status quo. And therefore, if I want to show my children that we mix and mingle with people from all walks of life and all demographics, I'm going to need to make sure that I have conversations with people from those walks of life and demographics, and that my children see that I don't have different conversations based on skin colour or based on monetary or financial level of affluence of a person, etc., and that people are treated well. One of the things that I personally do with my children is that we go out and we feed the homeless as a family once every 3 months, and then we do something called basket brigades at Christmas. donate food, get together, pack it, and then distribute it among families who don't have enough to feed themselves each Christmas. And so by doing things like that, I show my children that we need to care for people who have less than us, and that we need to treat people who have less than us with the utmost respect. And I think that if parents do things like that, they show their children that actually we don't discriminate because someone's poor, or we don't discriminate because of someone's skin color, etc. It means that children grow with tolerance. And I think that that is one of the fundamental things that we need to ensure that we're doing for the next generation. I recently posted on LinkedIn a guide for parents who want to teach their children at home, because it's all very well to say that TikTok will do it or schools will do it, etc. But actually, we are our children's first teacher, and we need to make sure that we are children's best first teachers from one perspective. And the second is the concept of meta-learning. And meta-learning is developing a love of learning itself rather than learning something specifically. And so if we are able to encourage and foster in our children that they love to learn, regardless of what that learning looks like, whether it's reading, writing, and arithmetic, or learning to code, or learning a new dance, or learning to do the TikTok craze, or what have you, the concept of adoring learning something new is one of the things that I think is the biggest gift that parents can give to their children. Because if we're able to encourage children to love to learn, then no matter what comes with automation or globalization or what have you, children will understand that they just need to keep learning, keep growing, keep adapting, and they will be able to adapt to those circumstances.
That's really powerful. And I like to illustrate that with an example from my son's homeschooling period. He, let's just say, has not the best handwriting on the planet. And that's because he inherited that from me. We both have some Aspergian tendencies, and that sometimes comes with sort of like sensory issues. And so I find it actually quite painful to write for a long time. And then seeing him writing the school stuff, it just actually really painful. And then out of a sudden, I get a photo from him when he was at his mum's showing his first 50 or 100 followers on TikTok. I mean, bless him. He took the whole concept of, TikTok being a digital social global platform into the complete analog world, and had a huge, I think it was an A2, sort of like almost like a cardboard type big paper. And he wrote down every single one of these first followers. And I first didn't realize it was his handwriting. I was like, well, hang on a second. You just said you wrote that, Matteo? And he said, yeah, of course. And I couldn't believe it. And that's when I had an absolute epiphany, because he loved doing it. The purpose of writing was something which he absolutely wanted to do, because I think he then turned it again into one of these TikTok videos and likes and follow me and stuff like that. But the epiphany was I didn't recognize his handwriting, because it was contrasted to, I hate doing this, I don't like doing this, I don't like school, this classic sort of like 10-year-old narrative. And then out of a sudden, something that he absolutely is passionate about. So I can absolutely echo that. The love of learning is probably one of the gifts that we can give our kids to the next generation, so that they do something that they really want to do. I'd like to come back to what I said at the beginning, this whole disconnecting thing. And one of the things that I noticed in myself is the reconnect with myself and with nature and with other, I guess, more spiritual aspects of my life. Once you do that, you can't look away anymore. And that's why I've had sort of like hiatuses with regards to the news a few times already in my life, because I had the benefit when I was 20, 21, I studied what you call PPE in the UK. In Germany, it's a bit different. And I had this one seminar where we basically looked at, you would look at the German equivalent to the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Times, and really, really understand how the media programs our minds and how it really can bias our minds in a very political way, and especially the right-wing type way. And so, I feel that in the lockdown, I didn't do any news. Matteo sometimes said, Papa, you have to actually go on the BBC because the lockdown restrictions are changing or lifting. And so I did then. But other than that, I didn't do that because I wanted to really, really reconnect with who I am and what I believe in. And when you then zoom in to what happens in the US, with the murder of George Floyd, that's when it just becomes unbearable, because you've actually connected to, what makes us human. Yeah, I'm wondering how that lands on you and what you discovered really at the level of self about yourself in the last 3 months.
So I discovered that I'm naturally an introvert. And so I've actually really enjoyed not having to kind of be on all the time, the hustle and bustle of traveling into central London, etc. So I can completely empathize with what you're saying about being able to connect to nature. I'm one of the lucky ones. I have a 120 square meters of garden outside. And so we are able to go out and run around and play. And I have a dog. And so when I finish working, I am able to then turn around and enjoy nature and enjoy my dog and my family. And it feels a little bit like being on Christmas holidays, because during the Christmas period, we play lots of board games and we connect with each other in a way that we don't tend to throughout the rest of the year. And so lockdown has given us that. And even the children that are older now and live away from home, we are constantly Zooming, FaceTiming and connecting with each other, which is fantastic. So I love that lockdown has given us that. As I said before, what that also means is that my sphere has shrunk a little bit. And in the last 3 months, we haven't been out to feed the homeless. We haven't done any of the things that connects us, not just to each other, but to the wider world that we live in and to the world that absolutely needs to change. And so lots of what we've been consuming has been through media, and seeing the 8 minute 46 seconds of video of George Floyd was harrowing and distressed us all. I've cried countless times over the situation, but not just over the George Floyd situation, over Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and also over Christopher Cooper, because actually the Christopher Cooper incident, the bird watching incident, for those that don't know his name, and the Amy Cooper incident, she was the woman who called the police on him, was a real amplification of some of those microaggressions and micro racisms that lots of people of colour face on a day-to-day basis. That whole notion of you must be doing something wrong just because of the colour of your skin. And actually, even if you're not doing anything wrong, I can accuse you of doing something wrong just because of the colour of your skin, or assume it. Because even if you don't do the accusation, just the assumption is enough. It's been a real mixed bag in terms of that, because there's been, on the one hand, this amazing connection to nature, and on the other hand, there's been this revelation that actually, no matter how many years are passing, it's still very much the same. So when I grew up in this country, as I was growing up, calls of get back to your own country on the streets, on the buses, etc., was fairly commonplace, and things became more politically correct. So lots of those calls went into the shadows. But what we're seeing through coronavirus, through lockdown, and through the amplification of the incidents recently is that things went into the shadows rather than going away. And I think that that's more dangerous than them actually being called out, because what's in the shadows very rarely changes. And so one of the things that I would urge anyone listening to this to do is to go and find an unconscious bias test. Everyone has unconscious biases. Everyone, that's me included, everyone does. And it's about understanding what our biases are and how we might be passing those biases down to the next generation, and how we might be acting them out day to day in small microaggressions or micro racisms or micro biases that are going to be impacting the lives of the people that are around us.
That's a great tip. I'll definitely do that. And it's also really relevant for my work, because we have all sorts of unconscious biases with regards to boardroom level female executives and so forth. So thank you very much. I'll definitely do that. And I'll report back what came up for myself. So what you say, 100% hell yes to all of that. That could take 10, 50, 100 years, 500 years. And one of the things I try to think of a lot in almost any field, in any subject matter expertise, is what is the lead domino? Like what is the lead domino that, if put in motion, would put all the other dominoes in motion? Or you could also say, conversely, what is the main obstacle that, if removed, would make all the other obstacles be removed much easier? And coming back to this whole race class issue that we've talked about a lot today, I'm just thinking about loud and want to canvass your views here. What if we just abolished the whole notion of an identity in your passport? Why do we have to put down that part of our identity time and time again for all sorts of applications, and yet no one's ever asking us about our hair color?
I think the lead domino needs to obviously just be a Black woman in charge. I think that might solve some problems, because I don't think it's as complex and as difficult as we make it to make some of the changes. I think some of them are pretty simple, because it's just a case of stopping doing what isn't working and starting doing something else, and testing and seeing what exactly it is that works. However, we've seen time and time again that when we criminalize something and we say there's a war on this, or don't do that, or quit smoking, etc., people do not do what they've been told. However, if you bring in e-cigarettes, or you do something that creates a new normal and you push people towards that, you find that everything that you had a war on before suddenly changes, because people are about to be occupied elsewhere. So you exemplified this perfectly earlier when you said that getting Matteo to sit down to write for school can sometimes be a battle, but getting him to sit down and write for TikTok isn't. I can tell you that I had exactly the same issue with times tables with my children. And what I did was sing the times tables over the Taylor Swift backing track so that they could sing along to the times tables, and they learnt them within 3.5 weeks. So I think that what we need to do is turn around and start making it easy for people to do the right thing, rather than putting bans and obstacles in place. And if we did that consistently across all of the areas that I was mentioning before, we would start to see real strides towards the utopia that I was describing. And then the second question, I'm torn on this one, Marcus, purely because I think that if we don't put our identity down and everybody is treated the same, then I think that that is exactly where we need to be, i.e. people genuinely do not treat people differently because of skin colour or what have you. I think that the main issue is not the ticking of the box, it's the division that the ticking of the box creates. So by identifying as Black African or white European or Chinese Asian, etc., we then end up in a silo that means that we should only identify with people that are the same as us. And I think that's the real problem, as opposed to the box ticking. The ticking of the box for me works at this time, because I think we actually need to tick more boxes and do more measurement, because of the fact that there are so many disparities. We have gender pay gaps, we have ethnicity pay gaps. If we don't measure those things, then actually we could end up going back a few steps and making the status quo back to what it was before, which is a certain subsection of society earns more, does more, lives better, is better educated, and perpetuating that same cycle over and over again. And I don't think that is the right thing to do. So I think that we need to measure at the moment. However, when we get to a place where there is equality, when we have leveled up, when actually I could be an Indian man living in Bradford and have exactly the same experience as a Chinese female living in Southampton and as a Black female living in London, or a white male living in Cambridge, then we will no longer need it. But as it stands at the moment, I think that we do, because if we don't measure things, they simply don't change.
That's true. And wow, Erika, there's a lot of work to do. And I'm really glad that you already do so much work as an entrepreneur, as a mum, as a social activist, as a researcher. If I had the chance to vote in this country, I'd vote for you if you ever ran for any public job. I just have a last question for you. If you could design a billboard message that would be massive, like, on a train line or overlooking the A3 that cuts through Surrey, what would it say and why?
Probably just Black Lives Matter, because actually that's what I feel right now. That's what I am 100% behind right now. And it would say that because I want to see specific funds, not funds that are necessarily 0.1% of the entire amount that's under management by a firm, but actual, real, genuine investment into people who have been historically disadvantaged. And I say that on behalf of the Asian male in Bradford and the Chinese female in Southampton and the Black female in London, because actually all of those communities have been historically disadvantaged, none quite like Black communities, as is borne out through evidence. And so actually in helping us to alleviate poverty, it will bring up the entire ecosystem. And that's exactly what we need to do as a human race right now.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't want to go back to that kind of normality. I guess I would really struggle to look in the mirror and especially have my son standing next to me and saying, "Papa, what did you do?" And yeah, let's stay in touch. Let's connect whenever there is a meaningful way to connect on the lines of, I'm a coach, I'm a consultant, I can offer certain expertise, certain influencing skills, for instance. That's something that I would be more than happy to get involved with people from minority communities and disadvantaged communities, because I think it's really, really important that they have a level playing field, that they have the skills that people like myself have acquired, have been able to acquire, because that probably will also make a difference. So take me up on it if you like.
I will, Marcus, but I also want to say that actually mentoring, coaching, skills development, while absolutely necessary, we have Black coaches. We have infinitely skilled people in our communities. The skills and the pipeline is not the problem. The pipeline is that we are not funded. So we are overskilled and underfunded. We are overrepresented in university graduates and education. We are not funded. We've got amazing people within the community, absolutely incredible. Look at Gary Stewart. Look what he did with Wyra. He's a Black man. There's no ifs, buts, or maybes about that. And he's a gay one as well. And he's from a working class background originally. So these are my whole points, is that actually just given the opportunities, i.e. the money or whatever it is that we need to make something work, we will make it work. That isn't the problem here. The problem is that we don't get given the opportunity. And I've seen so many platitudes is all I can say, because we have people that are saying now from the government that they will invest £3,500 into entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds who want to start a business. Now, let's be honest. What business can you start with £3,500?
Just consulting or anything where you pay, where you get basically you sell your time and you get instant revenue, but nothing that requires any kind of capex. Yeah, absolutely.
And so you cannot create a scalable business with £3,500. It's impossible, right? So it's the aspiration of my community that distresses me most. It's not our aspirations, it's the aspirations of people about us. Why do you think that we are not capable of creating a scalable company? Of course we are.
And I think you really caught out that blind spot. Like when I applied for a loan, I think 2-3 years ago with my bank, I just got it. And this is exactly the kind of like the systemic Well, on the one hand, it's a systemic blind spot on people like on my end of the spectrum. And obviously it's a systemic, I guess, racial inequality that is probably 10 times harder to get that funding, if you're black or from any other minority background. And it just one of the things that I was absolutely gobsmacked, Erika. I've even printed it out. I didn't use it in the end in the interview. When I looked at your LinkedIn profile, you have an array of qualifications that if I had to read this out as in like in a very sort of like comprehensive way, like not running through it fast, like, okay, Erika is a Prince 2 certified practitioner. Erika is also this and that. It would probably take a minute. And guess what? White men, they don't have to do that. Early on, I'm not ashamed for it, but I am very much aware that when it comes to top talent in the consulting, coaching, entrepreneurial space, and I look at women, and then specifically now with the intersectionality that you mentioned, it's almost like a ratio of 10-1 that other people have to put in order to get to the same level of either impact, status, money, whatever it is. And yeah, it's just gobsmacking, really. It really is.
But you see, this is my whole point. And that's the old normal. No one knew that. Now people are starting to understand that, because I sent my CV off the other day because I wanted to apply for a board position. And the woman that's running the company turned around and said to me that my CV was the most intimidating thing that she's read in a long time. And
I agree.
The thing is, Marcus, you were there. I had a company that was preloaded to 2 million devices, and people would not give me Series A funding. Now, if you built my company and went for Series A funding, you would have probably gotten 15 million to do what I managed to do on £280,000. And this is the problem that we face at the moment.
This is not just the racial inequality problem. This is an economic problem. Where could Charisma Kids be had it gotten the funding? And to your point, I'm currently working with, as you almost might imagine, an all-white male board of a high-growth company that has gotten the Series C, actually. I absolutely get it. And this is why we have to change it for both reasons, for the moral reasons and for the economic reasons.
Absolutely, because I would have returned so much more to the economy because of the fact that if I'm able to do what I did on £280,000, imagine what I could do with 15 million. And this is 30% more. That's the stat. That's the average as well. It's not even that's the outlier. It's average 30% more. And so the status quo is missing out on opportunities by not investing in people like me, by not investing in people that don't look like themselves. And so that's why I'm saying, rather than saying, woe is us, poor us, we didn't get investment, it's a case of, actually, we didn't get investment. That is a shame. But do you know that if you had invested, this is what you could have made? Because we don't need charity. We don't need a philanthropic fund. We need a fund that expects exactly the same amount of returns, the 10x returns, because we will deliver them, and we'll deliver them at 30% higher returns.
Is there one black unicorn? Has there ever been one in the whole of the tech world?
So there aren't any black unicorns, because I don't think anyone's been invested into the level that they would need to be a unicorn. However, 9 of the 14 unicorns have mixed teams. No one's saying only invest in black people and all teams need to be all black. No, it just needs to be fairer.
I wouldn't be surprised if Gary Stewart is going to launch and then scale the first black unicorn. He certainly has the ambition for that.
100%. I wouldn't be surprised by that either. And actually, I think that what we're all starting to do now as a community is work together in order to turn around and say, actually, this is the time. We need to see this change and it has to happen. But you see, I've never heard of a unicorn being created without having investment. And if you don't invest in the unicorns, you don't make them.
And on that note, how can people reach you? Where can people connect with you on the socials?
I am at Erika Brodnock on pretty much everything: Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And then also there is Extend Ventures. Extend Ventures has already produced a report that shows some of the disproportionate effects on Black businesses through COVID-19. So please do go to the website. It's www.extend.vc. Go download the report. That will kind of connect you into our mailing lists. But other than that, I can be reached on all the social medias at Erika Brodnock.
Erika, thank you so much for your time, for your insights, for your wisdom, and also for the challenges and the mirroring, I guess. That's what we all need. And you mentioned unconscious bias. I guess that was one of them. And I wish you really good luck with all of what you do, and catch you soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcus. Much appreciated.
Thanks for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. You can find some useful links in the podcast notes. I have lined up some amazing guests for the next few episodes, and I would love your feedback, thoughts, and suggestions so that I can evolve this experiment based on what's needed in the business world right now. I want to make capitalism much more conscious, and for that we need businesses to have more purpose, more people to show more leadership, and organizations to have more positive impact on stakeholders, including our blue planet, the only known habitable place in the universe. You can email me on hello@marcusdroon.com or search for Marcus Droon on LinkedIn. Please do subscribe to my podcast and share this with others. Catch you soon. Not back to normal.